You know what the most intelligent person in the room is usually doing? They are sitting quietly, asking simple questions, and making you feel like you are the one who knows everything. That is not an accident. Psychology shows that some of the sharpest minds alive deliberately hide how much they understand. Not from weakness, but from a complex set of reasons most people never think to examine. This video explains why. The first thing to understand is that hiding intelligence is rarely a conscious decision at the beginning. It usually starts in childhood. A child notices that knowing too much makes them different. And different, very early, feels dangerous. Research on gifted children consistently shows that many learn to mask their abilities to fit in socially. The brain adapts. It learns that connection feels safer than being seen as exceptional. That lesson often lasts a lifetime. The second reason is that highly intelligent people often become uncomfortable with being wrong in public. The more you know, the more clearly you see how often certainty falls apart. So you stop announcing what you think you know. Psychologist Carol Dweck's research on intelligence and identity found that people who closely tie their self-worth to being smart are more likely to avoid situations where they might appear less capable. Silence becomes a form of protection. The third pattern is staying quiet in group conversations. If you watch carefully, you will notice the person who speaks least is often the one following every thread, tracking every gap, and understanding more than anyone around them. Neuroscience explains this clearly. High cognitive load, meaning your brain processing many layers at once, reduces the urgency to speak. The brain is too busy evaluating to simultaneously perform. Talking and deeply listening do not always coexist well. The fourth pattern is asking questions instead of giving answers. This looks like curiosity on the surface, and it is. But it is also something else. It is a way of learning while appearing to know nothing at all. Socrates built an entire philosophy around this. Modern research from Harvard Business School confirms that asking questions rather than providing answers is one of the most effective ways to gain influence while managing how much you reveal of yourself. The fifth pattern is deliberately using simple language. When an intelligent person explains something clearly and plainly, we sometimes assume they do not understand it deeply. The opposite is almost always true. Simplicity takes far more skill than complexity. Richard Feynman, one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century, made this his personal test. If he could not explain something simply, he did not yet understand it well enough. Simple language is not the absence of depth. It is its clearest expression. The sixth pattern is downplaying achievements. Someone finishes a difficult project and says it was not that hard. Someone solves a complex problem and immediately redirects attention to what still needs work. You have probably met this person. You may be this person. Psychology calls this self-handicapping in reverse. Instead of making excuses for failure, these individuals minimize success. Research suggests this often develops as a social shield. If you never claim too much, no one can take anything from you. Now consider this for a moment. Think of someone in your life who always seemed to know exactly what was happening, but rarely said so. Who listened carefully and spoke carefully. Did you ever wonder what they were actually holding back? The seventh pattern is a deep discomfort with praise. When someone genuinely intelligent receives a compliment, something in them often resists it. Not because they are ungrateful, but because they privately know how much they still do not understand. This connects directly to imposter syndrome. Psychologist Pauline Clance, who first defined it, found the phenomenon most concentrated among high achievers. The more aware you are of your own gaps, the less the praise lands where it was aimed. There is something almost painful about receiving recognition for something you know you could have done better. The compliment reminds you of the distance between where you are and where you sense you could eventually reach. It does not comfort you. It unsettles you. The eighth pattern is becoming an observer first. Intelligent people who hide it often walk into new situations and go almost completely silent. They are reading the room, mapping the relationships, understanding who defers to whom before they say a word. Psychologists who study social intelligence describe this as environmental scanning, a process where the brain collects large amounts of contextual data before committing to a behavioral response. It looks like shyness. It functions like strategy, whether or not it is intended that way. The ninth pattern is avoiding correction even when they know something is wrong. Watching someone state something inaccurate and choosing not to correct them is more cognitively demanding than it sounds. You have to override the impulse. Most people cannot. Research on social cognition shows that correcting others activates dominance hierarchies in group settings. Many intelligent people learn early that being right out loud carries social costs that being quietly right does not. So they stay quiet and carry the correction internally. The 10th pattern is the most private one, a persistent feeling of being fundamentally different from most people around them. Not superior, just wired differently, seeing things at a slightly different angle that is almost impossible to describe without sounding arrogant. Psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski studied what he called overexcitabilities, heightened sensitivity across emotional, intellectual, and sensory domains, and found them clustered in individuals of high intelligence. The world simply arrives louder for some minds, and that volume changes how you move through it. Now consider this for a moment. Every pattern described so far shares a common root. The intelligent person learned, at some point, that being seen clearly was not safe. That showing the full picture of their mind cost them something real. The cost was sometimes connection, sometimes acceptance, sometimes just the ordinary ease of fitting in without having to perform a quieter version of yourself. The hiding was not dishonesty. It was survival, adapted into a habit so old it became invisible. What makes this worth understanding is not the intelligence itself. It is the loneliness that often travels with it. The gap between what you understand and what you can share without the conversation becoming something else entirely. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from always having to translate yourself, from taking what you actually think and softening it, slowing it down, or holding most of it back so the conversation does not break under the weight. People who hide their intelligence are not being fake. They are being careful. They have learned through experience where the edges of acceptable candor are, and they stop just before they reach them, every single time. That requires a kind of constant vigilance most people never notice. There is also something worth saying about the people who misread them. The colleague who assumes they are not contributing. The teacher who thought they were not engaged. The friend who assumed nothing was going on beneath the quiet surface. The quiet ones are almost always going on beneath the surface. The absence of visible processing is not the absence of thought. For certain kinds of minds, the deeper the thinking, the less of it appears on the outside. What psychology has slowly made clear is that intelligence is not one thing. It is not a trait that always announces itself the same way. Some versions of it are loud and confident and fast. Others are still and careful and delayed. The still and careful version is the one this video is about. The one that watches more than it speaks. That prefers understanding to winning. That would rather be genuinely right in private than loudly right in public and partially wrong. There is a particular kind of courage in that. Choosing depth over display. Choosing real comprehension over the performance of comprehension. Staying curious when you could just perform certainty. That choice costs something, every single day, and most people never see it. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, here is something worth sitting with. The hiding did not start because you were ashamed of your mind. It started because you were trying to stay connected to people you genuinely cared about. You made yourself smaller so the room could feel bigger. You held back so others could step forward. You asked questions instead of giving answers because you genuinely wanted the conversation to keep going. That is not a small thing. But here is what psychology also shows. The hiding over time begins to cost you more than it saves. Connection built on a quieter version of yourself eventually strains under the weight of everything that never got to speak. Research on authenticity and psychological well-being consistently finds that people who can express their full range, including their intelligence, their questions, and their honest observations, report significantly higher life satisfaction and fewer chronic symptoms of loneliness. The goal is not to perform your intelligence. The world has enough of that. The goal is to stop performing the absence of it. There is an important difference. One is showing off. The other is finally being honest. Finding the people who can receive the full version of your mind is not a small or quick task, but it is a necessary one. And once you find them, the version of conversation that becomes possible will change what you thought connection could feel like. Think back to where we began. The most intelligent person in the room sitting quietly, asking simple questions, making others feel capable. That picture is real, but underneath it lives an entire interior world that almost no one ever gets to see. Not because they are cold, not because they do not want to be known, but because they learned long ago that showing everything too quickly to the wrong people costs more than the moment of connection is worth. The psychology of hiding intelligence is ultimately the psychology of protection. And like every form of protection, it starts as something necessary and wise. The question is whether it eventually becomes something you chose or something that simply runs without you anymore. The real invitation in understanding all of this is not to judge the hiding. It is to ask whether the person you have been protecting others from is actually the most real and interesting version of yourself that has ever existed. Intelligence that hides is not a problem to fix, but it is a story worth understanding, because the mind that learned to make itself smaller to survive deserves, at some point, to discover what happens when it finally stops.